As in 1790 of the Common Era, he was while on the frontier in the midst of Indian hostilities, and several times barely missed being set upon by the savages. Half didn't see that coming, but anyways. A whole night he paced a sentry's best, watching for the redskin foe. Again, after a long and weary mountain ride, he was sheltered at a house protected by armed guards. What about the foe that provoked these people? But all conditions, as all places, were like to him. So he turned in and slept, with no disturbing dreams. In his journal he wrote, "I do not fear. Nature is spent with labor. I would not live always. Hail, happy death. Nothing but holiness, perfect love, and then glory for me." This is the generation of those who overcome by the word of their testimony. At the end of his 5,000 miles of travel, the weary itinerant dragged himself through a storm of rain to Baltimore. He had scarcely more than arrived when, as he tells us, in came Dr. Coke, of whose arrival we had not heard, and whom we embraced with great love. This was the last day in October. The General Conference was to convene the next day in the Light Street Assembly Room, the meeting place of the General Conferences. There has been a considerable difference of opinion as to whether or not this should be considered the first General Conference of the Church. Some early church historians have so named it, but the weight of the statement is in favor of including the Christmas Conference in the number of General Conferences and placing it at the head of the list. All the conferences from 1773 to 1778 inclusive were general, but they were not autonomous bodies. Only conversations conducted by Mr. Wesley's personal representatives and the preachers. The Christmas Conference was empowered under its Magna Charta, Mr. Wesley's letter, to act with no limitations except the rule of the Scriptures and the primitive church. The Christmas Conference was a general conference, but it was more. It was, as Dr. Abel Stevens describes it, an extraordinary convention called to create a new ecclesiastical jurisdiction. But after separating these extraordinary powers from the general content, there will be found remaining the identical functions, legislative and jurisdictional, of those assemblies that were later known by the canonical name of General Conference. The General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, South, at the session held in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1894, ordered that the reckoning at the head of its journal should include a recognition, parenthetically entered, of the Christmas Conference as the initial sitting in the series of the General Conferences. The position thus taken is historically impregnable. Asbury contemplated the meeting of a General Conference with much concern, because he feared that radical changes in the organization and discipline of the Church would be attempted. Early events of the sessions showed how well his fears were grounded. The attendance at the conference was large. There were now more than 270 preachers in the connection, and as all were eligible to sit, a vast majority of them appeared. Furthermore, it was expected that, in view of the rapid extension of the work, this would be at the last assembly of this character that could ever be held, and this spurred many to attend from great distances. Bishop Asbury modestly declined to share the presidency of the session and withdrew from the conference room, asking to be excused from assisting to make laws by which himself was to be governed. He also knew that he was to be assailed, so he said, "Speak your minds freely," and left the conference to itself, with Dr. Coke presiding. Those were the times in which precedents were made. On the first day, the conference drafted rules of order. It was also then determined that only by a 2/3 vote could new disciplinary rules be made, or old ones abolished, but that any rule might be altered or amended by a simple majority. At the suggestion of Bishop Asbury, a preparatory committee was appointed and directed to bring forward proper matters for consideration in conference. This was the expiring ghost of the council. It proved to be a wire of paper before a flood. Within 3 days after the conference opened, legislation was being lugged in by the ears, and the tribunal of proprieties promptly dismissed. It was now that James O'Kelly came forward with his historic resolution directed against Asbury. The subject of this revolutionary document was that if any preacher considered himself injured by his appointment, he should have liberty to appeal to his conference, and if the conference approved of his objection, the bishop should appoint him to another circuit. This contention was espoused by strong men, and some of them close friends of Bishop Asbury, as Hope Hull and Freeborn Garretson. On the opposite side were men like Jesse Lee, Thomas Morell, and Nelson Reed. For a long time it seemed that the issue was certain to carry, but after a prolonged debate, it was decisively defeated. As a result, O'Kelly and several other members of the conference left their seats and withdrew from the church. With O'Kelly went a young Virginia preacher whom Asbury had ordered the year before. He was a choice young man and a goodly, and the soul of Asbury yearned after him. For many weeks, the disaffected disciple was won back and became Asbury's traveling companion and confidant. That was William McKendry, whose apostolic labors rank only second to those of Asbury in the Church of the New World. The action of the General Conference in rejecting the measure proposed by O'Kelly settled the appointing power of the episcopacy upon a basis which has suffered no change to the present day. Young McKendry, who followed for a time the schismatic O'Kelly, became later the champion of the episcopal prerogative and was recognized as the constitutional expounder of Methodism. The discipline came in for material change and alterations. Its oft-revised categories were now marshaled into 3 comprehensive chapters: The first chapter concerned the ministry, the second, the membership, and the third included the sections on temporal economy and the doctrinal tracts and church offices or rituals. The prophecy of the annual conference is distinctly read in the empowerment of the bishops to unite two or more districts together to form a conference or to participate in a sitting. The title presiding elder appears this year for the first time in the discipline, and the duties of that officer come out more clearly than before. After a 2 weeks sitting, the General Conference adjourned, having settled in stronger terms the church polity, and having provided for a general governing body to sit every 4 years, to be composed of all the traveling preachers in full connection, as against the eligibility of all the traveling preachers in this and the Christmas conference. Thus, the historic session, which began in storm and confusion, ended in peace and the promise of victory. Problems that had vexed the church from its foundation had been solved, and greatly needed legislation had been secured. Asbury saw his desires realized by means, the employment of which he had contemplated with dread. After a sifting and shaking process, he found his position stronger than before. Dr. Coke praised in the highest terms the abilities, moderation, and unselfishness of the American preachers as exhibited in the debates and votes of the conference. With these felicitations, the little doctor took leave of his brethren and again sailed for Europe, leaving the oversight of the continent to his toiling colleague. It is doubtful if Coke ever at any time fully appraised the possibilities of the American work, or saw how great an opportunity for service he was letting slip in giving so little time to the bishopric to which he had been consecrated. Yet, in the hearing of his self-given missionary commission, he possibly found his providential sphere. Now, we've come across the word savages. Now, why did they use this for the natives? Well, the Bible says to take off the natural man, and the natives tend to favor the natural world and either worship the god of this world and age or worship various entities that they consider to be promoting their real nature.